Sun beat down on the crowded terminal as flights were delayed and travelers grew restless. Among the sea of impatient faces, she blended in effortlessly, wearing a simple linen dress, sunglasses tucked into her hair, and a small camera slung around her neck. To anyone watching, she was just another tourist, maybe here for the beaches, maybe for the ruins, maybe for the photos she quietly snapped of the architecture. Nobody paid her more than a passing glance. She was invisible in her ordinariness, and that's exactly how she liked it. The group she had been waiting with shuffled toward the transport bus that would take them out to the aircraft. Families with children, elderly couples, and a handful of business travelers, 320 souls in all, unaware that fate had arranged their paths to collide. She smiled politely when someone bumped into her, offered her seat to a mother carrying a sleeping child, and kept her voice soft, never once letting the steel of her past peek through. But behind those calm eyes, she was watching. Every detail, every movement, every sound in the terminal and out on the tarmac was processed with razor-sharp awareness, though no one would have guessed. Years of combat flying had taught her to read environments the way others read newspapers. She noted the unusually tense voices among some of the ground crew, the way one man lingered near the baggage carts too long, the faint unease in the air. Her instincts whispered something was wrong. The bus rumbled forward, carrying them toward the waiting aircraft. The plane itself looked ordinary. Charter markings, bright and inviting. But she couldn't shake the feeling. The closer they drew, the louder the warning in her head became. She remembered missions where hesitation cost lives, where ignoring her gut had led to disaster. She adjusted her sunglasses, disguising her glance as she scanned the perimeter. That's when she saw it. A glint of metal just for a second beneath the wheel well of a support vehicle parked too close to the plane. It was nothing to the untrained. To her, it was everything. Her heart rate spiked, though outwardly she appeared calm, even bored. She was a woman on vacation, nothing more. That mask had saved her life in war zones before. It would save others now. As passengers filed onto the aircraft, laughing, chatting, and complaining about delays, she lingered near the back of the line. She was calculating, running scenarios. If she was wrong, she would look foolish, maybe even be arrested for causing panic. But if she was right, the child she had earlier given her seat to stirred awake, rubbing sleepy eyes. The mother smiled gratefully at her again. That was the moment the decision locked into place. She could not ignore the warning, not when lives, hundreds of them, were in the balance. She stepped aside, pulling her small satchel tighter over her shoulder, and let the last few passengers climb the stairs ahead. Then, instead of boarding, she turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the security zone with a confidence that made a nearby guard instinctively stiffen. "Ma'am, the plane's boarding," he said politely. Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of command she hadn't used in years. "Then you'd better listen carefully, because if I'm right, none of us are boarding that plane alive." The guard froze. The words didn't match the woman in front of him, the tourist with a camera, the polite traveler who had blended in all morning. But her tone belonged to someone who had seen war, someone who had given orders at 20,000 feet while enemy fire laced the sky. For the first time, the mask she wore began to slip, just enough for a glimpse of the woman underneath. And though nobody yet knew it, the revelation of who she truly was would soon determine the fate of 320 lives. The guard's expression faltered, shifting from polite patience to unease. He glanced at her camera, her dress, the sandals on her feet. Nothing about her screamed threat. She was just a tourist, but the way she carried herself now, her shoulders squared, her tone steady, her eyes unblinking, it reminded him of someone giving orders, someone who had been obeyed before. "Ma'am, maybe you should—" he started. She cut him off, her voice firmer this time. "I'm telling you there's something wrong. Get your supervisor." Passengers were still boarding, oblivious to the quiet exchange. The guard hesitated only a moment before keying his radio. Within seconds, a senior officer approached, his irritation clear. "What's the problem here?" She turned to him, speaking low but fast, every word sharp. "There's a device planted under the support vehicle by the starboard side of that aircraft. I saw the reflection. Metal casing. Too smooth to be a tool. If you let that plane leave the ground, you're gambling with 320 lives." The officer narrowed his eyes. "And you just happened to notice that?" His tone dripped with disbelief. She didn't flinch. "I didn't happen to notice. I was trained to notice. I've seen IEDs disguised as hubcaps, detonators hidden in water bottles, explosives wired into radios. Do you really want to wait until you hear the explosion to believe me?" For the first time, the officer studied her, not the camera around. Her neck, not the civilian clothes, but her stance. Feet planted, shoulders square, calm breathing. There was no panic in her, only the kind of certainty he had seen in men who had spent their lives in uniform. Still, protocol was protocol. He waved to another guard. "Check it, just to clear her." Two men moved toward the vehicle, muttering under their breath about paranoid travelers. She kept her eyes locked on them, her hand unconsciously flexing at her side as though ready to reach for a control stick that wasn't there. Seconds passed. Then one of the guards stiffened, his face drained of color. He shouted something, and suddenly the tarmac erupted with movement. Passengers were rushed back down the stairs, pulled away from the boarding gate. Alarms blared. A bomb squad was called in, and as chaos unfolded, people turned their eyes toward her, the quiet tourist who had somehow known before anyone else. The senior officer grabbed her arm. "Who are you?" he demanded. For a moment, she said nothing. She let the question hang. In the air, her gaze steady, and then she answered softly but with finality. "I'm a pilot, or I used to be." The officer blinked. "Civilian?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Combat, Apache gunships, 2 tours, call sign Valkyrie." The Iwe name hit him like a weight. He had heard it before, in stories and briefings whispered by other servicemen. A pilot who had flown through storms of fire and come back when others hadn't. A ghost of the battlefield, thought long retired. But before he could ask more, the situation escalated. A muffled boom rolled across the tarmac. Not the plane, but a smaller vehicle near the perimeter fence. Smoke rose as panicked voices filled the terminal. Whoever had planted the device wasn't working alone. "Multiple threats," she muttered, scanning the chaos. Her instincts were awake now, sharper than ever. This wasn't just a single bomb, it was a coordinated strike. She could see it in the patterns, in the timing. "Get these people inside," she barked suddenly, her voice cutting through the panic. Soldiers moved without thinking, obeying her as though she were still in command. The officer glanced at her, startled, but he didn't stop them. There was no time. As crowds were herded to safety, she stayed behind, eyes on the sky. Somewhere beyond the smoke, she heard the faint thrum of rotors, unmistakable even under the alarms. Not commercial, not rescue, military. Or worse. The officer followed her gaze. "What is it?" Her jaw tightened. "That's not one of ours." And in that moment, as the shadow of an unknown helicopter began to cut across the sky, the truth became clear. Saving those 320 lives wasn't just about stopping a bomb. It was about a much bigger fight, one she had thought she'd left behind forever. But fate had dragged her back in, and the tourist mask was gone. The thrum of the helicopter blades grew louder, slicing the smoke-filled air like a drumbeat of impending doom. People were still being pushed back toward the terminal, their cries and confusion echoing across the tarmac. But she didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on the dark silhouette descending through the haze. The officer at her side squinted upward. "Could be police support." She shook her head, calm but absolute. "No. Look at the angle. The descent speed. Whoever's flying that bird knows this isn't about crowd control, it's about intimidation. And she was right. The helicopter emerged fully from the smoke, its black fuselage gleaming under the harsh sun, unmarked, no insignia, no ID. Numbers. Its side doors were already open, and the glint of heavy weapons mounted inside made her stomach tighten. Whoever they were, they hadn't come to negotiate. The officer swore under his breath, shouting into his radio for reinforcements. Panic rippled through the security personnel, many of whom had never faced a military-grade threat. They were trained for unruly passengers, not coordinated ambushes. The sight of that helicopter froze them where they stood. But not her. Her eyes tracked every movement, every pitch of the rotors. The old instincts surged back with terrifying clarity. She wasn't a tourist anymore. She was Valkyrie again, the pilot who had flown Apache gunships over hostile terrain, the woman who had earned her call sign by swooping into battle when all seemed lost. And yet, as she stood there, part of her hesitated. She hadn't touched a control stick in years. She had sworn never to return to the battlefield, not after what it had cost her. Her last mission still haunted her. The comrades who hadn't made it back, the explosion that had left the scar across her abdomen, the silence of the empty hangar when she had hung up her helmet for the final time. But then her eyes fell on the families huddling behind barricades, the children clinging to their mothers, the sheer terror rippling across the crowd. 320 lives, innocent lives. And suddenly, hesitation wasn't an option. She turned sharply to the officer. "You've got a hangar here, don't you? With training aircraft?" He blinked at her. "What?" "Training aircraft," she repeated, her voice steely. "Helicopters, transports, anything with rotors still functional. Don't waste time telling me what you don't have. Tell me what I can fly." The officer stared at her for a long moment, still caught between disbelief and urgency. Then, with a reluctant nod, he jerked his head toward the far side of the tarmac. Old UH-60s, retired birds, not combat ready. One might still run. Her lips tightened into a line. One will be enough. They sprinted across the tarmac together, weaving between scattered luggage carts and fuel trucks as alarms wailed overhead. The unmarked helicopter circled lower now, firing warning bursts from its mounted guns into the empty runway, each impact shaking the ground beneath their feet. Civilians screamed. Soldiers ducked. And through it all, she kept running, her stride, long and determined, her camera bouncing uselessly against her chest. The hangar doors groaned open, revealing two dust-covered helicopters, their paint faded, their tails sagging like old war horses left to pasture. Mechanics had stripped parts from them over the years, but one still looked intact enough. Its dull frame seemed to awaken under her gaze as though recognizing the pilot who now approached. She climbed inside without hesitation, fingers moving across the console with the familiarity of muscle memory. Dust coated the switches, but she knew their order as intimately as a pianist knows her keys. Battery, fuel, rotors. She flicked switches, adjusted throttles, her voice murmuring checklist commands she hadn't spoken in years. The officer stood in the doorway, staring in disbelief. "You really think this thing will fly?" She shot him a glance that silenced further doubt. "She'll fly. Trust me." The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, shaking the hangar walls. For the first time since the ambush began, hope flickered across the officer's face. She adjusted the headset, the old weight of it pressing down like a crown she thought she'd never wear again. As the rotors began to spin, chopping the air into a deafening rhythm, memories surged. Nights flying low across desert canyons, evasive maneuvers under enemy fire. The calm that always came over her when she gripped the controls. Her fear melted into focus. The world narrowed into the sound of the blades, the feel of the machine awakening under her command. The unmarked helicopter spotted the movement. It banked sharply, angling toward the hangar with predatory precision. Bullets tore across the tarmac, sparking against the concrete. She didn't wait. With a sharp pull, the old bird lurched upward, rising into the sunlight, shaking but alive. The ground fell away beneath her, the chaos below shrinking into noise. She felt the machine settle into her hands like an old partner recognizing her. Touch. The officer clung to the side seat, wide-eyed, gripping his harness as the helicopter steadied. She barely noticed. Her gaze was locked on the enemy bird ahead, her jaw set, her heart beating steady. "You wanted to know who I am," she said, her voice low, almost to herself. The officer looked at her, pale, trembling. She tightened her grip on the controls, eyes fierce. "I'm Valkyrie, and I don't miss." The two helicopters cut across the sky, one dark and menacing, the other rising from retirement like a ghost returned to battle. And for the first time, the passengers below, those who had thought she was just a tourist, looked up and realized the truth. Their lives now rested in the hands of a combat pilot who had once vanished into silence. And she was ready to fight. Again. The unmarked helicopter banked hard, its side gunner unleashing a spray of bullets that cut through the sky like angry wasps. She yanked the controls, the old bird groaning as it twisted into a steep, evasive climb. The officer beside her clutched the dashboard, eyes wide with terror while she remained calm, her hands steady. The years melted away. Every maneuver, every instinct came flooding back. Below, the runway was chaos. Families huddled under cover, security forces scrambled for order, and the sight of two helicopters dueling above their heads was something none of them could have imagined minutes ago. To them, she was still just a tourist, until now. The enemy bird swooped lower, attempting to intimidate the panicked crowd. She gritted her teeth. They're not here just to scare. They want to massacre. The thought filled her with fire. Not, again, not on her watch. She pushed her helicopter forward, engines roaring in protest, and slid directly into the enemy's path. The officer shouted, "Are you insane? This thing wasn't built for combat." Her eyes never left the target. Neither was I. But we adapt. The black helicopter responded with a violent turn, circling back like a predator testing its prey. Its gunner leaned out, aiming for her cockpit. She ducked instinctively, rolling the aircraft just enough to make the burst of fire glance wide. The officer screamed as tracer rounds seared past the windows, but she only smirked, the adrenaline sharpening her focus. "You'll have to do better than that," she muttered under her breath. Then came the twist, one she hadn't anticipated. The gunner wasn't firing randomly. He was targeting the fuel trucks lined up along the far end of the tarmac. One spark, one explosion, and hundreds could die instantly. Her heart pounded as she realized the stakes weren't just in the sky. They were everywhere. "No, not them," she whispered. She pulled the helicopter into a sharp dive, the old frame, rattling violently as she forced it to move faster than it was ever meant to. Wind roared against the glass. The officer shouted something incoherent, but she tuned him out, every ounce of focus locked on intercepting the gunner's line of fire. The black helicopter adjusted, its barrel swinging toward the fuel trucks. She had seconds, maybe less, and then instinct took over. She swung low, tilted the bird sideways, and positioned herself directly between the enemy gunfire and the fuel convoy. The first rounds hammered against her helicopter's armor, sparks flying, metal shrieking. The officer yelled in panic, but she stayed steady, gritting her teeth as the machine groaned under the assault. For a heartbeat, it felt like déjà vu. She remembered the last time, her final mission years ago, when she had made the same decision, shielding ground troops from incoming fire, taking the hits herself. That mission had left her scarred and broken, had convinced her to walk away. And yet, here she was, doing it again, because it wasn't in her to turn away. The gunfire stopped suddenly. Smoke poured from the enemy gun as it overheated. She seized the moment. With a sharp pull, she yanked the controls, swinging her helicopter. around in a wide arc until she had the black bird in her sights. The officer shouted, "What now?" "We don't have weapons." Her eyes burned with determination. "Then we use what we've got." She accelerated, engines screaming, closing the distance faster than the enemy expected. The black helicopter banked to escape, but she mirrored. Its movement, every adjustment precise, every turn predicted. She wasn't chasing him, she was hurting him, pushing him away from the runway, away from the civilians. Then came the final twist of fate. As the enemy pilot pulled too sharp, straining for altitude, his rotor blades clipped the tip of a crane near the maintenance zone. The sound was like thunder, the shattering of metal against metal. The black helicopter spun violently out of control, smoke trailing as it spiraled downward. She banked hard, pulling away just as the enemy bird slammed into an empty section of the airfield. The explosion shook the ground, flames rising high, but no civilians were harmed. The ambush was over. Silence filled the cabin for the first time since takeoff. The officer was pale, trembling, staring at her with something between awe and disbelief. You just saved them. All of them. She exhaled slowly, the adrenaline fading, her grip loosening on the controls. For the first time, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. She had sworn never to fly again, sworn to bury Valkyrie with her past. But here she was, back in the sky, saving 320 lives because fate had demanded it. The helicopter wobbled slightly as she guided it back toward the tarmac. Down below, the passengers who had once seen her as just another tourist now looked up with tears, applause, and shouts of relief. Some pointed at her like she was a ghost, others simply wept, clutching their children. As she landed, the officer turned to her, his voice hushed. "Who are you really?" She removed the headset slowly, her gaze distant, heavy with memories. Then she spoke, soft but unwavering. "I told you. I'm Valkyrie. I was a combat pilot. And when the sky calls, I answer." The rotors slowed, the machine groaning to rest. She climbed down, blending once more into the chaos of survivors, her linen dress streaked with sweat and dust. To them, she would always be the woman who saved them, the tourist who wasn't just a tourist, but to herself, she was something more. A reminder that no matter how far she ran from her past, some battles were meant to find her, and she would always rise to meet them.